Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky, so now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have no idea where we are.
These are probably the last words that you want to hear from your pilots, and yet a variation of this is exactly what the passengers of Varig Flight 254 got to hear. Now, what led up to this absurd situation is both a fascinating tale about the limitations of the human mind and a lesson in how not to act in a cockpit. Stay tuned. The 3rd of September 1989 was a nice and mostly clear day over central Brazil. There were only scattered clouds around, but the continuous burning of rainforest in order to clear land for agriculture was causing some localized areas of what's known as dry fog or smoke. Back then, the dominant airline in Brazil was Varig, who operated a large fleet of Boeing aircraft, including the Boeing 737-200, which was a real domestic workhorse. Now, at that time, it was still common in Brazil to operate flights in a train-like fashion by starting a flight in one city and then conducting intermediate stops at different smaller airports where passengers could either stay on or disembark depending on where they were traveling to. If you were unlucky and wanted to fly all the way to the end destination, this could mean a quite long journey, lasting the whole day, and it was in this way that Varig Flight 254 was being operated. The flight had started in Sao Paulo in the morning and then operated north up through Uberaba, Uberlandia, Congonhas and then Brasilia, where a cruise change was scheduled to take place. The flight was then planned to continue up to Imperatriz, Marabá and finally Belém, which was situated close to the Atlantic coast, next to the mouth of the Amazon River. The two pilots who were taking over the flight had been spending their time awaiting the arrival of their aircraft by looking through the weather, NOTAMs and flight plans for the coming 3 flights. The weather was, like I mentioned before, very nice, and the departure time was also quite civilized, so they were both in a very good mood as the day's duty started, and it looked like everything was going to be quite straightforward. When they looked through the NOTAMs, there wasn't many things written up, except that an NDB called CRJ, Carajás, was inoperative and had been so for the last 4 months. An NDB is a non-directional beacon and is one of the least sophisticated navigats that we use in aviation. It basically works by sending out a continuous radio signal, typically between 150 to 530 kHz, which is then interpreted by the aircraft's automatic direction finding (ADF) instrument, who turns a needle towards that beacon. It's a very crude instrument, one that can make any fresh instrument pilot start sweating when thinking about using it for holdings or approaches, but it generally does a very good job. Just like any other navigate that we use, it also transmits an identification Morse code, which we pilots have to listen into and verify before using it for navigation. And since it transmits on lower frequencies than other beacons, it has a quite long range, which can follow the curvature of the Earth slightly. But this also makes the NDBs very sensitive to environmental disturbances like thunderstorms, obstacle and the ionospheric layer in the atmosphere. Remember that. In any case, it seems like the two pilots didn't look too closely at that particular NOTAM. An inoperative NDB was not a big deal, since for the most of the 3 flights there was other, more precise VOR beacons available, and this particular NDB was not even planned to be used on any of those routes. Also, since the weather was really nice, the captain was quite confident that he would be able to navigate visually if he needed to, using the low-level navigational charts that they were carrying with them. Back in 1989, the aviation infrastructure, especially around rural, remote areas in the Amazon rainforest, was very sparsely built out, so navigating partly visually was not as uncommon as it is today. On top of that, there was also a complete lack of radar coverage for a large part of Flight 254's coming journey, and GPS was not readily available yet. It would still take several years before that would become a standard on almost all aircraft, and that's also worth remembering. Who were the pilots who were going to operate these flights then? Well, the captain was 32 years old and had been flying for Varig for the last 7 years. Before that, he had been operating for the Brazilian Air Force and had then flown on the Boeing 727 before finally becoming a captain on the 737 almost exactly 1 year prior to this flight. He had a total flying experience of just over 6,900 hours, of which 980 had been flown on the 737. His first officer was 28 years old and significantly less experienced. He had only been employed in the airline for a little over a year and had started flying on the Boeing 737 very recently, in March of 1989. Together, this meant that he had flown a little under 900 hours in total and only 442 hours on the 73. Now, it's pretty safe to say that with the strict hierarchy that existed in Varig at the time, combined with the captain's prior military background and the first officer's low experience, the power gradient between these two pilots was likely quite steep, but that was not highlighted in the final report. I should also mention here that I'm basing this story on both the final report and some eyewitness accounts, including the first officers, as the report in itself wasn't very detailed. Anyway, when the aircraft finally arrived in the early afternoon, the two pilots were ready and they walked out in order to meet the aircraft on the apron. It was a beautiful 737-200 with its cigar-shaped, low bypass JT8 Delta engines howling under the wings as it pulled up to the stand. The pilots let the passengers disembark before they entered the aircraft, greeted the cabin crew and then talked a little bit with the off-going pilots. They reported that the aircraft had been behaving beautifully and that there was no open technical issues with it. So with those good news, the pilots thanked their colleagues and started preparing the aircraft for the departure, where the first officer would be pilot flying for the first leg and the captain would fly the following two. All checks went by smoothly, and that meant that the aircraft soon took off for the first flight up towards Imperatriz and then onwards towards Marabá. These flights were reportedly completely uneventful, except that the captain encountered some difficulty in landing at Marabá due to a heavy layer of smoke that had moved in over the airport. The visibility through that smoke had been made even worse by the fact that they were landing in the late afternoon, but the sun would have illuminated the smoke at a very low angle. Anyway, they did eventually manage to land and then taxi in, and while some of the passengers were disembarking, the first officer went outside to do the walk around while the captain started setting up the aircraft for the last short 40-minute hop over towards Belém. Now, this last leg was a little bit different than the previous ones because there was no published airway connecting the two airports with each other. Airways are like motorways in the sky, and they are clearly marked out on low and high level IFR charts, which we pilots always have access to. The airways, especially back then, generally went between different ground-based navaids, with the courses between them clearly marked out. The captain was very used to navigating using these charts, but because he couldn't do that on this leg, he instead had to look down on his flight plan, which also included the courses between the different waypoints. In this case, he was especially looking for the first magnetic course to follow after departure. And here we come to one of the first clues of what caused this debacle. You see, Varig had only a few months earlier started operating aircraft with an autopilot system that was able to accept heading data with a precision down to 1/10 of a degree. The Boeing 737, however, could not do that, but to keep things common across the fleet, the airline had started issuing flight plans with the courses depicted as a 4-digit number instead of the standard 3 digits. But for some reason, they hadn't included any comma or decimal point in those 4 figures to highlight the fact that the last figure was 1/10 of a degree. And this meant that when the captain now, likely for the first time since this new format had been introduced, looked down on his flight plan to find that first course, what he saw was 0270. This was supposed to mean 027.0 degrees, meaning a north-northeasterly track to follow towards Belém, but it's quite easy to see how it could be interpreted as 270 degrees instead. So without thinking more about it, the captain set a bug on his horizontal situational indicator, HSI, of 270 degrees to remind him of what course to follow after departure, and then he just continued with his setup. Now I'm guessing that quite a few of you are right now spitting out your coffee. Because even with a very limited knowledge of navigation, most of us knows that 270 degrees is a straight westerly course, and that would make absolutely no sense if you're intending to navigate towards a destination up in the northeast. But this is nonetheless exactly what happened. After this, the next thing the captain needed to set up was a relatively new system of the 737, known as the Performance Management System, or PMS for short. This was a crude predecessor to the flight management system, designed to help optimize the aircraft's flight profile based on performance data and the distance to the destination. The system would help to calculate when it was time to start descending, give inputs to the auto throttle, and inform the pilots regarding things like fuel performance, etc. But the PMS was not connected to the navigation system per se. It only counted down the distance flown from the total distance entered. So the captain entered 178 miles to the destination from his flight plan and then started his final flight deck preparation. Meanwhile, the first officer had been outside, and when he came back into the cockpit, he looked down at the same flight plan as well as looking at what the captain had set on his HSI and just copied that over onto his own instruments. Now, when you are planning to fly an aircraft according to Instrument Flight Rules, IFR, you are required to set up the instruments so that the aircraft can be flown and navigated safely without any outside visual references. In this case, that would have required the pilots to tune the navaids that they were going to use en route, which consisted of an NDB beacon near the runway at Marabá and a more precise VOR beacon at their destination. Now that VOR at Belém might be out of range early on in the flight, but there was also another VOR close to the route at Tucurí, which could have been used as a verification. We don't know exactly what type of departure briefing that the captain did, or if he did any at all, but in any case it didn't include those navaids because they were never tuned. Instead, it seems like the captain thought that the weather was so good that it would be easy to find Belém Airport visually if he just followed his initial course. That type of navigation is known as dead reckoning and is normally used when there is a total lack of navaids, so all you really have are tracks and timings. You could maybe argue that the captain had a timing here since the PMS was primed and ready to go for him, but if you're going to do this, which is very rare by the way, you better make sure that you're following the correct track. In any case, I highly doubt that any real departure briefing actually took place, since that would have definitely highlighted the absurdity of that initial westerly track that they were now planning. But instead, the last 48 passengers were boarded, giving a total count of 54 passengers and crew on board when they finally started taxiing out for the departure into the sunset. As the Boeing 737 was now taxiing out and started getting closer to the holding point, the pilots were busy completing their final cockpit checks before departure. Several of the passengers in the back were really nervous because at the same time Brazil was playing Chile in a deciding qualifier game, determining which of the two teams will get to play in the 1990 World Cup. Some of the passengers actually asked the flight attendants if they've heard anything about the score, and this was relayed to the pilots, who in turn asked air traffic control about it. Now, this is something that happens almost all the time, even to this day when there are important matches being played, and ATC normally are really helpful if they have time, which they did have in this case, meaning that the pilots were able to give the passengers a match update. And this fact actually led up to one of the early theories about this accident, that the pilots were actually listening to a football game in the cockpit, when in reality they just got that information told to them by ATC, and that's what those witnesses then misinterpreted. Anyway, when we're on the topic of air traffic control, the airport in Marabá was uncontrolled, so the only ATC interaction the pilots had was with the Flight Information Service officer, who was sitting in a separate building away from the runway. He did not have any type of access to any radar screen nor any other advanced tracking equipment. Instead, his only job was to provide weather and traffic information and apparently football scores. But that meant that when the pilots were ready for departure, they informed the FIS officer, who then likely just gave them runway clear together with the latest wind information. After that, it was up to the flight crew themselves to depart by their own discretion, and then eventually switch over to the Belém controller once they had gained some altitude. At time 17:35 local time, the captain first stabilized the engines at 1.4 EPR and then set takeoff thrust, which caused the 737 to start accelerating down the runway. The takeoff was completely normal, and after reaching around 1,000 feet, the captain asked for the flaps to be retracted and then started turning towards his first indicated track of 270 degrees. Given that this was now in the late afternoon, that initial track would have meant that the aircraft was turning straight towards the setting sun, glowing bright orange through the dense smoke layers. Now, this should have served as a first indication that something was definitely off. Both of the pilots should have known that their destination was located to the north of them, meaning that some type of basic spatial situational awareness should have kicked in here, but sadly it didn't. Instead, the pilots just focused on completing the after-takeoff checks and continued their climb up to their intended cruise altitude of flight level 290 or 29,000 feet. As they got up over the smoke layer, the Amazon jungle started stretching out before them in the fading sunlight. As expected, the visibility was good, so the captain was confident that he would be able to find his way towards the destination visually. He looked down on his PMS, which showed that the nautical miles left to destination was ticking down as expected, and this likely just reaffirmed his feeling of being on the correct track. But remember, this PMS was only counting miles flown, not if it was flown in the actually correct direction. Now, if the Marabá and Belém nav aids would have been tuned, they would have clearly shown that something was now very, very wrong, but since they weren't, they were not of any type of use here. As the flight continued, the pilots soon did tune in the Belém VOR in order to start getting guidance towards the airport, but strangely, it didn't seem to work. This initially confused the pilots, who knew that they should now be well within range of that beacon, and they therefore decided to contact the Belém air traffic controller to check if the status of the VOR was okay. But when they did that, there was initially only static heard on the frequency. This was truly strange, so the pilots started suspecting that maybe they were suffering from some kind of radio malfunction here. They started looking at the circuit breakers, which was located behind them, but none of them had popped and everything else seemed to be working as it should. The captain then suggested that they should try the HF radio instead of their normal VHF radio, and when they did that, they finally managed to contact the Aeronautical Information Service officer in Belém. This caused some initial confusion, as this AIS officer was sitting in a separate room in the tower away from the active controllers, but eventually he managed to start relaying information between the aircraft and the actual controller in charge. Meanwhile, the pilots had continued to try and use their normal radio and had managed to get into contact with another aircraft inbound to Belém. That aircraft reported that the nav aid seemed to be working fine and that they could talk to the Belém controller without any type of problems. Obviously, this was all super confusing for the pilot, but if we look at what was actually going on here, it all makes complete sense. Since the aircraft had now been flying for over 20 minutes in the wrong direction, it meant that they were now well outside of the range of both the VOR at Belém and the normal VHF radio from the controller. The HF radio was operating at a lower frequency and therefore had a significantly longer range, which is why they were able to get into contact with that AIS officer. And the fact that they were able to reach that other aircraft was likely due to both the position of that aircraft, which might have been closer to them, and the fact that it was significantly higher up, helping to extend the range. In any case, the captain was now looking out through his window, trying to locate the characteristic bay next to Belém, but no matter how much he squinted, he still couldn't locate anything that he recognized. All he could see was the setting sun in the west and the dense jungle stretching out below them. They had now been flying for 23 minutes, and since this was only supposed to be a 40-minute flight, the PMS indicated that they had already passed the ideal point to start descending. The captain saw this and told the first officer to ask the controller for an initial descent clearance. The first officer complied and sent his request via the HF radio to the still confused AIS officer, who managed to get the confirmation from the controller that they could indeed start descending, initially down to flight level 200. This very confusing situation had also meant that there had not been any time for a proper approach briefing or verification of any other intermediate nav aids. So as this descent was now initiated, they were still essentially flying blind, and it was now also starting to get dark outside. The aircraft continued flying, with the pilots anxiously scanning the horizon in front of them for any signs of their destination, and when they looked down on their PMS, it soon showed that they should be overhead Belém, and then that they had passed it with 5, 10, 20 miles. How could this be? Maybe they had entered the wrong mileage into the PMS or something. The AIS officer continued asking them to please try and reach the Belém air traffic controller directly on the VHF frequency instead, but it was of no use. All that the pilots could hear on that radio was static and the odd call from some other aircrafts. When the PMS finally showed that they had overflown the destination by 30 nautical miles, the captain assumed that they must have somehow missed the airport, and he therefore reversed their course and started flying back the same way they had come. In order to not miss it again, they now also asked the AIS officer to relay a request to descend to an even lower altitude, down to 4,000 feet, because from that height they should definitely see the airport. Now, I think it's really interesting to see just how strong confirmation bias and denial can actually be here. These two pilots now thought that they must have overflown their destination and somehow missed it, knowing full well that 30 nautical miles past their destination they should have been out over the Atlantic Ocean, which they clearly were not. Still, they now descended onto an easterly heading, hoping that they would be able to see the destination airport, which by all logic couldn't possibly be below them. At this point, they had also flown longer than their intended total flight duration, almost an hour into the wrong direction, and by descending down to a lower altitude, they will now encounter much denser air, which would reduce the remaining range considerably. But the captain was not worried. He was supremely confident in his navigational skills, and according to the first officer, who had now started to seriously doubt their position, the captain was also arrogant and just dismissed his concerns. At this point, they had about 1.5 hours of fuel left, which should have been plenty to get them back to Marabá, the airport that they had just left, if they would have tried. But instead of going for that, the captain seemed dead set on getting themselves and the passengers to Belém. This is something known as get-there-itis, which could have been triggered by the captain fearing repercussions from the airline if he didn't complete the flight. As they were now descending, the first officer continued trying to find something to navigate on, and he remembered that there were a couple of commercial radio stations in Belém transmitting on frequencies that the ADF equipment in the aircraft would be able to tune in. If he could find those stations, the ADF needles would start pointing towards those transmitters, and that would make them finally able to hopefully find Belém. The first frequency he tried came in just barely, with a transmission covering that football game we talked about before, but the second came in loud and clear, playing a live Sunday religious service. The frequency of this transmission should have belonged to Radio Liberal in Belém, and as soon as the signal was received, the ADF needle now started pointing straight to the south. While the first officer was fiddling around with this, the captain was still looking outside as the descent continued, and he saw a big river suddenly stretching out from left to right in front of him. Maybe this could be the Amazon. If that was the case, well, then he knew that it would take them towards their destination if they could just figure out which way to turn. And that was soon decided by the triumph of the first officer's attempt to turn in Radio Liberal. So all of a sudden, they now had both a river and an instrument pointing where to turn. So with the Sunday sermon streaming through the ADF receiver and the aircraft descending through 10,000 feet, they now turned their aircraft to the right and started following the river down towards the south. Again, here it's probably worth pointing out that the Amazon River is probably one of the most well-known features in the Brazilian landscape, and the pilots must have known that it flows west to east. So again, how would it make any kind of sense to follow a river towards the south? This is just a further example of how confirmation bias works, where only indications that confirms the bias is considered and everything else that speaks against it is ignored. It was now almost completely dark outside as the aircraft leveled off at 4,000 feet and turned to follow the twists of the river. The two pilots were anxiously looking outside, hoping that the lights of the city would appear behind every new turn, but they never did, so something was still obviously very wrong. If they had just missed and flown past the airport initially, it should have appeared long ago, as they had now been flying for almost another hour at 4,000 feet. It was only now that the first officer started to remember that the initial heading towards Belém had supposed to be a reasonably low number, meaning a northerly heading. And when he now looked outside, he could clearly see the Southern Cross constellation ahead of them. What was going on? The captain must have obviously thought the very same thing, so he now asked the first officer to find the low-level navigational chart and have a look at the correct tracks. And when he finally found it, they realized their mistake. They had been flying 270 degrees after departure instead of 027 degrees, which meant that the river that they were now following couldn't possibly be the Amazon. In reality, they were following the Xingu River, but they had no idea about that, obviously. And I can't even begin to fathom the feeling that these two pilots now must have felt in their stomachs. They had flown their airliner full of people in completely the wrong direction for over 2 hours and were now following some unknown river into the jungle as their fuel was steadily decreasing. Since they had left, they had made so many twists and turns that even if it would have been initially possible to find their way back to Marabá, now it would be close to impossible without the help of some sort of reliable nav aid. But what about the ADF and that radio signal that they had been following? Well, here this story would almost become comical if it wasn't so crushingly sad. Because it turns out that the radio signals that they had been receiving didn't come from Belém as they had assumed. Instead, it was coming from another radio station called Radio Club de Goiânia, which was using the same frequency but was situated in a city called Goiânia, hundreds of kilometers to the south. Now that station should theoretically be out of range, especially at that low altitude, but due to atmospheric conditions on this evening, the signals had bounced on the ionosphere, greatly extending their range. This, by the way, is why it's not a great idea to use signals from commercial radio stations for navigation, since it's very hard to verify their true origin. The pilots obviously didn't know that they were now tracking a false signal, but they did know that time was of the essence. They needed to find out where they were fast, otherwise they would run out of fuel before they could reach any airport. At the time they realized their mistake. They had been flying at 4,000 feet for 1 hour and 14 minutes, meaning that the total time they had now been airborne was 2 hours and 10 minutes on a flight that had been planned to last only 40 minutes. They had taken some extra fuel with them, obviously, but now there was less than 1 hour left before they would run completely dry, especially if they kept flying at this low altitude where the fuel burn was significantly higher. Now you would think that pilots in a situation like this would call out a mayday call and try to muster up any help they could possibly get, but that didn't happen. As I mentioned before, there was no radar available in the area, so there wasn't much that ATC could have done anyway, but maybe they could have come with some valuable suggestions, or at least they would now know that the aircraft was completely lost. The controllers in Belém had initiated the uncertainty phase when the aircraft still hadn't arrived an hour after their takeoff time, but a full emergency still had not been initiated. The pilots knew that they had to do something, so the captain initiated a climb to 8,500 feet in order to try and get into contact with some NDB nav aids in either Marabá or maybe in the more southern airport of Carajás. And when those frequencies were tuned, they actually did pick up signals, again telling the pilots to turn towards the south, now with only 1,800 kilos of fuel left. But in yet another cruel twist of fate, it turns out that what the ADF receivers were actually picking up here were neither of those nav aids that the pilots were hoping for. Remember, the Carajás NDB had actually been notamed as inoperative, and Marabá was now just too far away. Instead, those signals belonged to NDBs in Goiânia and Barra de Garjas, who were using the same frequencies, and those signals had also bounced off the ionosphere, reaching much further than they were designed to do. Now the pilots would have known that if they would have taken the time to carefully listen to the Morse code identifiers of those nav aids, but confirmation bias is, like I mentioned, a very powerful thing, and in the situation that they now found themselves in, they likely refused to accept any indications that would counteract their own mental model of what was going on. Soon, the captain asked the first officer if he could try to locate the L3 low-level navigation chart, as he had a hunch that they might be somewhere in that area, southwest of Marabá, which was actually a very good guess. The first officer tried to find that chart, but in the dark cockpit and under this extreme stress, he never managed to find it. And that was very unfortunate, because if he would have, they would have figured out that they were actually still in range of another airport, a military base called Cachimbo, about 100 nautical miles away. But since he couldn't find it, they instead just continued on their southerly course, chasing those faulty NDBs. The minutes continued passing by in what must have felt like hours, and soon the terrifying reality started creeping in. They were going to run out of fuel and would have to make a forced landing in total darkness in the dense Amazon jungle. Now this realization didn't cause the pilots to start panicking, nor did they start making any particular preparations for the coming crash. Instead, a feeling of resignation started spreading, and they were both heard saying things like, "Maybe this be nothing but a dream." This clearly shows something known as disassociation, meaning that they didn't feel like this was happening or was real, or that it was happening to them, which is often the case for people that are experiencing severe stress. Apart from that, they could also be heard talking about a possible compass failure, which had caused them to make this horrendous mistake. But since the CVR only recorded the last 30 minutes of the flight and they had already figured out what had happened well before that conversation took place, it is quite likely that those remarks were made to be captured on the CVR on purpose in order to try and hide what had really happened from the investigators. Anyway, since a crash now seemed inevitable, the captain also picked up the PA mic and for the first time on this very long flight explained the situation to the passengers. Now, he obviously couldn't say that they had made a mistake, so instead he told them that they had experienced a navigation malfunction and that they therefore would soon have to make a forced landing in the rainforest. Now, the final report didn't specify how the passengers reacted to this, but according to some eyewitness accounts, two very different responses happened almost immediately. A large part of the passengers stayed quiet and softly started crying, while some joined hands in prayer, whilst other passengers instead stormed the forward galley and started helping themselves to various alcoholic beverages. This must have been a horrific situation for everyone, especially for the cabin crew who now had to prepare themselves and the passengers for a pitch-black emergency landing in the jungle. In the cockpit, there was still not much action going on. Both pilots were looking down in horror at their fuel gauges as they were now both quickly approaching empty. So, what could they have done here then? Well, if you know that you're about to make a forced landing, there are actually quite a few things that you should be doing. First of all, you must advise air traffic control about what you're going to do so that they can alert search and rescue resources. Then you obviously have to prepare the cabin crew and brief them so that they can maximize the cabin preparations and brief the passengers about what to do with the emergency exits and demonstrate the brace position, etc. Secondly, the cockpit must be set up accordingly and a crash briefing should be done, including what configuration to be used, speeds to follow and what area they should be looking for. Yes, I know it was pitch black outside at this point, but the weather was also clear, so by minimizing cockpit lighting, there was still a possibility that it could make out some features in the landscape, or maybe even aim for some lights in the distance rather than just blindly flying straight ahead. Another thing to remember is that it is always better to execute a forced landing with engine power available. That will maximize maneuverability and minimize descent rates so that, once again, the location of the crash can be more closely controlled and the G-forces minimized. On top of that, having two engines running would also make sure that all systems, instruments and lights would be available to them. So with that in mind, the best thing to do would have been to use that last bit of fuel remaining to actually land the aircraft, but that sadly didn't happen here. The pilots also never told air traffic control about how dire their situation actually was, nor about their plans for a forced landing. And that was despite the fact that they likely had ATC contact via their HF radio up until close to the end. The fact that the captain had guessed that they were somewhere on the L3 map could have been very useful information to share with the controllers, for example. Remember the golden rule of aviation? Aviate, navigate, communicate? Well, not a lot of that was being done here. Now, the pilots did discuss how they were going to execute the landing, but without actually looking for any guidance in their manuals, which would have likely given them some valuable pointers here. They decided to let the fuel completely run out and then glide towards the landing, concentrating on trying to minimize the vertical speed just before reaching the treetops. But with that plan, they also ignored some very important technical aspects, which will come into effect when the engines flame out, as you will soon come to see. At around 20:35 local time, the aircraft had flown for almost exactly 3 hours and the fuel was now down to only 100 kilos. The pilots had started the auxiliary power unit, the APU, to provide electrical power, but of course that also required fuel in order to operate. The left engine, engine number 1, was the first to flame out, and when that happened, the pilots initiated their descent down from 8,500 feet. They were now flying on a heading of roughly 165 degrees, still following the indications of those false NDB signals, and only about 1 minute later, the number 2 engine also failed. That was then quickly followed by also the APU shutting down, which caused the entire aircraft to go almost completely dark, except for the standby instruments in the cockpit and the emergency exit lighting, which was powered by the batteries. The only thing that could now be heard was the wind rushing by outside and the cries from the terrified passengers in the back. Without any engine power, the aircraft descended with around 1,000 feet per minute, and the captain tried to keep the speed just above the stall speed as the trees started getting closer and closer below them. The first officer kept calling out altitudes and other parameters as they descended, and the captain soon asked for the flaps to be extended so that they could start slowing the aircraft down. When the first officer heard this, he selected first flaps 1, then flaps 5, but due to the lack of fuel in the tanks, which normally cools the hydraulic pumps, these pumps now started overheating. As soon as this was sent, the associated pump automatically switched off, but the system still continued to produce some pressure through the windmilling of the engines. But this shutdown also produced a hydraulic low pressure warning in the cockpit, and when the first officer saw this, he instinctively reached out and turned off the associated pump switch. Whilst that would have been the correct thing to do under normal circumstances, in this case it meant that the isolation valve of that pump opened up, which then completely removed the pressure from the hydraulic A system. This in turn meant that the flaps stopped in position 2 and could not be extended any further. Fortunately, the B pump switches were left alone, which meant that there was enough hydraulic power to drive the flight controls, which would have otherwise reverted over to something known as manual reversion, where pure muscle power is needed to move the rudder surfaces, and I can tell you that that is really heavy to do. During the last few meters over the trees, the speed was around 115 knots and the descent rate about 800 feet per minute. Since there was only battery power available, the landing lights were also inoperative, which meant that the jungle would have only been seen as a more intense blackness now coming up towards them. The pilots had no idea if they were going to land in water, trees, rocks or swampland. All they could do at this point was just to pray and continue to fly their aircraft. The landing gear was never lowered, and it's actually quite hard to say which impact it would have had if it was. Normally, it's always advised to extend the gear when landing on land, since it will absorb some of the impact forces, but that's when the engines are actually working. In a situation like this, the gear would have obviously created more drag, which would have caused a higher descent rate, and it's unclear how much they would have actually helped when impacting the treetops. But in any case, none of this was even discussed by the pilots. At time 2050, the Boeing 737 finally impacted the tops of the 30 to 40 meter high trees in the dense jungle canopy. This immediately tore off both wings and pounded the underside of the aircraft, causing the cabin floor to start deforming upwards. Without the wings, the cabin just continued sliding forward down past the trees until it hit the ground with a mighty thud, bringing everything to a complete stop within meters. The aircraft had now finally crashed, but this story was still far from over. The force of the deceleration during the crash was calculated to be close to 15 G, meaning that it was far beyond the maximum force that the aircraft had been certified to be able to take. This caused some of the passenger seats to release from their fittings and then fly forward into the forward bulkhead, killing 8 people immediately and seriously injuring others. But as through a miracle, 46 of the 54 people on board had initially survived the impact, and as the worst confusion started subsiding, they began trying to evacuate and also to help the injured. When the doors were open, some of the emergency exit lights immediately deflated when activated, as they were pierced by sticks and trees outside, and some of the passengers who jumped out anyway then started running straight into the dark jungle, fearing an imminent explosion. But of course, a lucky byproduct of the fuel being completely exhausted was that there was now nothing really left that could explode. On top of the 8 passengers who had perished immediately, 4 more were critically injured, and they just needed to be brought to a hospital as quickly as possible. But how was that going to be possible? No one knew where they were. The air traffic controllers had since many hours by this point stopped all traffic that was going into their intended destination, Belém, in order to facilitate their eventual landing, and they had also, on the captain's request, reopened the airport at Congonhas, but there had been no signs of the aircraft anywhere. The formal search and rescue campaign started later during that same night, when it was decided that the aircraft must have run out of fuel by then. But where should they even begin to search? There was no sign of the aircraft, and the pilots had not given the controllers any clue about where they actually were. At the same time, in the jungle, the crew and the surviving passengers had tried to help the ones who were still trapped in their collapsed chairs. The captain was conscious and was helping to lead the effort, but the first officer had slammed his head into a metal part of his seat rest and was still unconscious at that point. Now, everyone tried to do whatever they could, but with the limited light and medicines available, there was very little that could be done during the first few hours. As daylight came, the captain managed to remove the emergency locator transmitter, the ELT, which is a small device designed to send out an SOS pulse on the emergency frequencies 121.5 and 243 MHz. But unfortunately, this ELT was not of a type that was activated by G-forces. Instead, it had been designed to be switched on only after a ditching in water and therefore had to be submerged in liquid. This meant that the passengers and crew now had to use whatever little liquid they could find, from everything including melted ice from the bar and their own urine, to try and submerge the device in a bucket to activate it. And after a while, it actually worked. One of the passengers were carrying a Walkman with them, and with the help of that, they could hear that the pulses were being transmitted in the form of interference in his headphones. But by now, they also had another problem: lack of water. You see, even though the rainforest is thought of as a place with abundant water, that's not always the case, so they now had to try to do something about that. Luckily though, it turned out that one of the survivors was a young forest surveyor, and with his help, a small expedition was sent out into the jungle and soon found a small stream of fresh water that was safe to drink. And some of the passengers actually went there to swim a little bit as well. Meanwhile, the search was now in full swing, and satellites had been activated in order to listen out for the emergency pulses that should be sent out by the ELT. Soon, faint signals could be picked up, which led the search and rescue teams far down to the southwest of the aircraft's expected flight path. But even though search aircraft was sent out over that area, nothing was found on the first day of searches. After the second night in the wreckage, the passengers decided that they would need to try and find help themselves. Another expedition, consisting of 4 passengers, was put together to start walking, and to their surprise, they only needed to move a few kilometers through the jungle before reaching open land, which had been slashed and burned into farmland. There, they found a farmer who, quite shocked, explained that he had no contact with anyone on the outside, but he thought that a neighbor a few kilometers away might have a ham radio. He took one of the passengers in his car and then drove him over there, and together with that neighbor, they now started transmitting their fantastic story out over the airwaves. Initially though, no one believed him, so he had to keep repeating his ticket number numerous times until someone finally took him seriously. Once that happened, the whole rescue effort then quickly converged onto the site, and with the help of those 4 survivors, the crash site was soon located from the air. This happened 2 days after the accident and 1,100 kilometers southwest of where they should have been. A helicopter airlifted rescuers to the site, but since the light was then quickly fading, the survivors had to endure yet another night in the wild, but this time with food, blankets and medicine available. Another 3 passengers had unfortunately succumbed to their injuries at this point, and one, who was later airlifted to the hospital, also didn't make it, meaning that 12 persons in total died as a result of this accident. But miraculously, the other 42 passengers and crew had survived, not only the crash, but also over 48 hours lost in the jungle. The investigation started immediately, and it was soon made clear that this accident had been caused by a combination of a colossal navigational mistake by the pilots, partially due to the unclear flight plan. This had then been followed by various human factors-induced mistakes and decisions who caused the pilots to fixate on their objective of reaching Belém rather than trying to make up a new plan, climbing to a higher altitude and make full use of air traffic control and nav aids. This was a true testament to how easy it is to dig yourself deeper into a hole when the right thing to do is to get out, look around with a fresh perspective and then start all over again. Obviously, this type of event would likely not have happened today with the availability of GPS, extensive radar coverage and about 1,000 other tools, but the principle stays the same. Sometimes it's way better to ignore the sunk cost, just admit to a mistake and then focus on a solution instead. There were several recommendations coming out of this accident, the most important of which probably was the mandatory inclusion of a G-activated emergency locator transmitter on the aircraft and, obviously, navigation and CRM training for all Varig pilots, plus the change of that 4-digit course description in their flight plans. Now I want to give a special shout out to Admiral Cloudberg, who helped me find a translated version of the original Portuguese final report, as well as her excellent article about this accident. I will link to her work in the description here below and I advise you to check it out. She is really great. Humans make mistakes, that's just a fact of life, but in the cockpit those mistakes can quickly have dire consequences, and because of that we have created loads of strategies to try and catch them. But what happens when almost everything conspires to undercut those strategies and create a situation where the pilots just cannot figure out what is happening? And they only have a few seconds left to do it. Stay tuned. The summer of 2007 was a really stressful time for everyone in the Brazilian aviation industry. Demand for flights had at that point been growing with around 15% per year for several years in a row, and to make things worse, Brazil's largest airline, Varig, had recently ceased operation. When that happened, other airlines had tried to expand to fill the gap, but the country's airport infrastructure just wasn't keeping up with the growth. Outdated airports and understaffed control towers caused delays throughout the networks, and by July 2007, over half of all flights in Brazil operated with large delays, which really infuriated the passengers. Pilots at TAM Airlines, the now largest airline in Brazil, felt the stress of this situation quite keenly. Over the previous 4 years, TAM had doubled in size, hiring thousands of new pilots and pushing them through training as quickly as was humanly possible. And once they were done, these pilots now not only had to face constant delays and congestions, but also angry customers who disrupted flights and assaulted airline employees. Now, TAM Airlines had tried to improve their customer relations by forcing one of the pilots to stay outside the cockpit and greet the passengers during boarding, but that was a policy that the pilots really disliked. Because not only did this new procedure expose them to a lot of anger and abuse, it also made the pre-flight checks and paperwork take much longer, which just worsened the delays. So overall, this situation was causing a huge amount of stress for the crews, but TAM Airlines didn't really offer any solutions or support to help them deal with it. In fact, the airline only had one aviation psychologist for the entire staff of over 5,000 pilots. But for the pilots involved in today's story, this background stress was only the beginning. In the evening of July 17, 2007, 2 TAM pilots arrived to the southern Brazilian city of Porto Alegre after a short domestic flight from São Paulo. Once they had landed and taxied into their stand, they immediately started preparing for a quick turnaround for the next flight back to São Paulo again. The plane that they were flying that night was a 9-year-old Airbus A320, which was not exactly in mint condition, but we'll get back to that in a moment. The pilot in command was a very experienced 53-year-old captain who had over 13,600 flying hours in total, including more than 2,200 on the Airbus A320. He was known by his colleagues as a diligent pilot who always read the fine print in the manuals and who tried to really understand every procedure and system that he was working with. But he could also be a bit slow, especially under pressure. His colleague and second in command was actually also a captain who was 54 years old and had even more flight hours, over 14,700 in total, plus some amount of unlogged hours as a flight engineer. But he had only about 237 hours on the Airbus A320, and even though that was the case, he had been hired directly as a captain onto that type only a few months earlier. Now you might be asking why there was a second captain on this flight instead of just a normal first officer, and the fact is that this occasionally does happen, that 2 captains will fly together, but it's normally pretty rare since schedules try to avoid it if possible. But in this case, because of that rapid expansion that I mentioned earlier, TAM Airlines' hiring, scheduling and training department weren't at the time actually communicating clearly with each other, and as a result of that, the airline had significantly more captains than first officers, which in turn meant that TAM often had to schedule flights with 2 captains together. I have flown with other captains many times myself, and I actually do enjoy that, but it comes with some real potential CRM challenges. You see, all captains are used to their own command style, and it can often be a bit awkward to tell another captain what to do. Because of that, it's really important that a clear briefing about who does what and who is in charge is done before the flight, since that normally helps quite a bit. But there is also another issue with this setup, and that is that a captain is often not that used to operate from the right seat anymore. There might have been years since we have sat in that seat, and therefore everything will look a little bit different from that perspective, especially if you have limited time on the type, as this acting first officer now also did. There is obviously training for this, something that we refer to as a right seat check, which we have to do every year, but that involves very minimal handling and almost nothing as pilot monitoring. Now, we don't know how much briefing these pilots actually did before departure, but we do know that they had not been especially trained for communication strategies between two captains in the cockpit, apart from that right seat check that I just mentioned. And that wasn't the only part of their training that was a little bit subpar. In fact, TAM Airlines had rushed a lot of their pilots very quickly through the training while converting its fleet from the Fokker 100 over to the Airbus A320. They did offer more theoretical training than Airbus recommended, but the amount of training in cockpit procedures was only 12 hours versus Airbus's 40, and simulator training was also 7 hours less than what Airbus recommended. Now, all of these factors had, of course, increased the level of background risk at TAM, but on this particular day, even more stress factors just kept piling on. For example, when the pilots had first picked up this aircraft earlier on that same day, they had found out that it was operating with one thrust reverser inoperative. Now, the purpose of the thrust reverser is, of course, to reverse the engine thrust in order to help slow the aircraft down after landing or after a rejected takeoff. And on the IAE V2500 engines, which this aircraft was using, the thrust reversers consisted of blocking doors who transisted aft along the outside of the engine, opening cascades to allow the bypass air to escape forward instead of backwards. Now, although the thrust reversers produce a loud, impressive roar during every landing, they normally only contribute a small portion of the aircraft's total braking power and are actually not required for dispatch during most conditions. This aircraft had suffered a fault with its right-hand thrust reverser several days earlier, but the TAM maintenance technicians had not been able to fix it yet, so instead they had just deactivated it and written it up in the hold item list in the technical log. When the pilots had seen this earlier on during the day, they had checked the corresponding procedures in the minimum equipment list, or MEL, who lists all of the systems that are allowed to be inoperative together with any procedures that might have to be performed. According to the MEL, the procedure for landing with only one thrust reverser was actually supposed to be the same as landing with two. During a normal landing, an A320 pilot first pulls the thrust levers to idle right before touchdown, and then when the plane touches the ground, the pilot then pulls the levers a little bit further back into the reverse position, together with the reverser handles. Now, if both reversers are working, that's great, but if one isn't working, well, then that's also okay, it just won't activate. So because of this, this actually was not seen as a huge deal for the crew, at least not on the first flight. In fact, on that flight over to Porto Alegre, they had followed this procedure and everything had gone perfectly. The captain only needed to use a little bit of rudder to compensate for the slight asymmetric thrust that this one thrust reverser was now causing. But their next flight, TAM Airlines Flight 3054, was going to take them back to Congonhas airport in Sao Paulo, which was a completely different ballgame. And that's because Congonhas airport was notorious in Brazil for being not only tricky, but at times downright dangerous. As a primary domestic airport for Sao Paulo, the largest city in South America, Congonhas airport was, and actually still is, the busiest airport in all of Brazil and the linchpin of the country's entire aviation network. But Congonhas is located in the middle of the city, surrounded by tall buildings with no room to expand, even though the main runway is only 1,945 meters long, which is not a lot for modern larger airliners. On top of that, the central position of Congonhas within the Brazilian route network was actually a major cause of the systemic delays back in 2007, since its limited landing slots and parking spaces created a bottleneck that had ripple effects far beyond Sao Paulo. For pilots though, landing at Congonhas was not just inconvenient, it could be genuinely scary. The main runway, 35 left and 17 right, had no runway end safety areas, or resas for short, since it was surrounded on all sides by steep embankments overlooking busy city streets. Now this of course meant that overrunning the already short runway by more than just a few meters could have potentially disastrous consequences. Now, up until the time of this story, there had never been a really serious overrun accident there, but a lot of pilots believed that it was just a matter of time. And not just because the runway was short and had no safety margins. No, one of the biggest problems was that the runway was also not very well surfaced, and it tended to become very slippery when wet, which was quite often. Airport authorities had taken several measures to try and mitigate the risks associated with this, including deploying special equipment to remove rubber from the runway, trying different surface additives, etc. But nothing had worked very well, since the water just tended to stay in puddles on the uneven surface. This caused the airport to eventually adopt a policy where whenever rain was observed, airport operations would be temporarily stopped, while a representative for the airport authority went out onto the runway to measure the friction coefficient and determine whether it was within limits. In May 2007, runway 35 left and 17 right had been closed for a proper resurfacing to try and solve this friction problem once and for all. The best way of preventing standing water is by, apart from making sure that there's no uneven areas for water to collect, to also carve grooves into the runway. With that, and with a surface that slopes slightly downward towards the edges, this will allow the water to run off the pavement while leaving the ridges in between exposed for optimal contact with the aircraft tires. However, as the runway restoration project neared its deadline, these grooves still hadn't been made. But the airport authorities still made the decision to reopen the runway on the 29th of June 2007 with a plan to install those grooves at a later, unspecified date. The decision to reopen the runway without grooves was not made with the input of Brazil's Civil Aviation Authority, ANAC, and that was because the entire renovation project had lacked ANAC approval, which was in turn because the airport itself, the busiest airport in Brazil, did not even have an ANAC operating certificate. The fact that ANAC was slow to act and struggled to accomplish even their basic safety oversight tasks only further convinced pilots that Congonhas airport was unsafe and that nobody was doing anything about it. Now, speaking of being ineffective, as it turns out later, ANAC actually had drafted a rule all the way back in 2006 that would have required passenger jets landing at Congonhas to have both thrust reverses operational, but after that rule was drafted, no one ever got around to actually implement it, which would soon have terrifying consequences. After reviewing the paperwork, greeting the passengers and completing all of the turnaround checks, the pilots of TAM Airlines Flight 3054 made their final calculations before departing for Sao Paulo. With every seat in the airplane filled, the weight of the aircraft was calculated at 66.9 tons, including 2.4 tons of extra fuel, because the airline had a policy of tankering fuel from Porto Alegre since it was much cheaper there. That meant that the weight of the aircraft on landing at Congonhas would be around 63.5 tons, which was only 1 ton below the maximum landing weight for that airport under the reported weather conditions. And to make things even worse, those conditions were not great. The active METAR for Congonhas indicated light rain over the airdrome, variable ceilings from 800 to 1600 feet, visibility 6,000 to 8,000 meters, and winds between 8 to 12 knots out of the north, fortunately straight down the operating runway. This weather was depressing, but still well above minimum, so there was no reason to start thinking about diversions, at least as long as the airport stayed open. But it would likely be quite slippery with that weather. With that information in the back of their minds, the crew pushed back from the gate, and at time 17:19 they received their takeoff clearance, departing Porto Alegre with an estimated arrival time in Sao Paulo of just before 1900 local time. The takeoff proceeded absolutely normally with no issues, but just after getting airborne, the Porto Alegre departure controller advised the crew that Congonhas airport had now been temporarily closed due to the wet and slippery runway conditions. By the time the pilots got that message, the airport had actually already reopened again, having been closed only for a few minutes whilst the runway friction was checked. But although the pilots soon were told that the airport was back open again, this would have likely reinforced their belief that they were flying into a potentially very tricky situation. In fact, just the day before, an incident had occurred at Congonhas when an ATR-42 from another airline had hydroplaned on landing, causing it to slide off the runway, striking a light pole and a concrete box, which caused the nose gear to collapse. Now, nobody had been seriously hurt in that accident, but the aircraft was so badly damaged that it was ultimately written off. And that had happened with only light rain reported on this new ungrooved runway surface. The pilots of Flight 3054 had likely heard about this and would therefore have been keenly aware of the potential risk that this now still wet runway would pose to them. In any case, Flight 3054 continued to climb towards their cruise altitude of 21,000 feet, and whilst they were doing that, they were continuously encountering quite rough weather with moderate to occasionally severe turbulence. Twice, the pilots had to request modifications to the route to avoid this turbulence, as well as building thunderstorms, which would have likely also increased their workload. At time 1803, they were finally informed that Congonhas had reopened, and that likely didn't come as a big surprise to them. You see, frequent starting and stopping operations at Congonhas was essentially normal, so hearing that it was closed was not a strong reason to divert, especially since a lot of pilots at the time felt an implicit pressure from the company management to avoid diversions, since that could just further hurt their reputation. As the flight neared its destination, the pilots would have carried out their descent and approach briefing, going over all of the items that they would need to know. This would have likely included landing distance calculations, procedures, and any threats they were facing, but since the cockpit voice recorder on this aircraft only recorded the last 30 minutes of the flight, the recording didn't start until after this point where the briefings would have normally happened, so we don't really know the full extent of those briefings. Now, during the descent, when the recordings finally started, we did get some hints about what the pilots were thinking of. The captain, for example, asked the acting first officer to verify the conditions at Congonhas, while emphasizing that this was especially important given that they would land with only one thrust reverser. The captain also complained that he had a slight headache, the reason for which was never determined, but I think that anyone could experience a little bit of stress headache under these kind of circumstances. Anyway, everything else was completely normal, and Flight 3054 soon started getting vectors for the ILS approach to runway 35 left, with the captain as pilot flying and the acting first officer as pilot monitoring. Now, it makes perfect sense that the captain would be flying this approach himself. He was both more experienced on the aircraft and was also sitting in the left seat, which was his normal seating position, while his more junior colleague was sitting in a seat that he was less used to. The conditions on the ground were now quite tricky and would require the full skill and attention of the captain, but it is worth remembering here that this also meant that the less experienced pilot would have the monitoring role, tasked with finding and pointing out any mistakes as early as possible due to his now significantly lower workload. Remember that. In any case, Flight 3054 soon successfully intercepted the localizer and glide slope and started descending down towards the runway. Quite quickly, they were completely stabilized, on speed, on glide slope, with a proper configuration, and with all of the checklists complete. Everything completely according to the plan at that stage. But the captain was clearly nervous, and you could see that by him asking the acting first officer to again ask the tower about the runway conditions. And this time, the answer was that the runway was now wet and slippery. When the captain heard this, he read it back to his colleague in an upset tone, showing that he definitely didn't like it, as he obviously recognized that these conditions were now very similar to those that had caused that accident on the previous day. And at some point during the approach, probably after hearing about those runway conditions, he likely made a fateful decision, one that came from a place of good intentions but would ultimately have tragic consequences. You see, the captain was an experienced pilot with over 2,000 hours on the Airbus A320, and he had likely flown with inoperative thrust reversers many times before. And when he had, he would have done so using a very different landing procedure. Remember how I said that the technique for landing with one thrust reverser was now the same as landing with two? Well, it turns out that that hadn't always been the case. Prior to January of 2007, the official Airbus procedure for landing with one thrust reverser was to below 10 feet, pull both thrust levers back to the idle detent, and then pull only the thrust reverser for the side with the operational reversers into reverse detent. However, between 1998 and 2004, there had been 3 separate A320 accidents where this procedure had been a factor, including one fatal accident in the Philippines. In each of those accidents, the requirement to move only one thrust lever contributed to the flight crew inadvertently leaving the other thrust lever in a forward thrust position during the landing instead of reducing it back to idle. After those accidents, Airbus recognized that this special procedure was therefore vulnerable to human error, since moving both thrust levers together at first and then suddenly splitting mid-procedure to move only one lever was both unusual and unergonomic. So in order to solve this problem, in January 2007, only a month prior to this flight, Airbus had updated the procedure to remove the requirement to split the thrust levers, making the procedure essentially the same as a normal landing with 2 reversers. This change was incorporated into the TAM Airlines MEL, which the captain would have looked at before Flight 3054, but there was a small catch. You see, normally the thrust reversers are considered an extra, a freebie if you will, and in fact some airlines doesn't even include them in the landing distance calculations normally, so that the actual distance to land always comes out at less than the calculated distance. This provides a nice cushy safety margin. But if the runway is wet and slippery, well then we actually have to include the effect of the thrust reversers, because when the runway is slippery, the wheel brakes are less effective, meaning that the reversed thrust accounts for a greater percentage of the overall braking capability. If one thrust reverser is inoperative while landing on a contaminated runway, we obviously have to increase the calculated landing distance relative to what we would have if we had two thrust reversers. But with this new Airbus procedure, it also added another 55 meters to the landing distance on top of that already existing penalty. And why was that then? Well, it turns out that that was due to the way that the electronic engine control system on the Airbus A320 was designed. You see, when a thrust lever is moved into the reverse detent, it's actually commanding an increase in engine thrust to increase the reverse thrust. But if the reverser doors doesn't deploy to deflect the airflow, well then that thrust would increase in the forward direction instead, even though the thrust lever is in the reverse detent. Obviously, when the discrepancy between the thrust lever position and the actual thrust output reaches a certain value, the Airbus A320 Full Authority Digital Engine Control System, or FADEC, would intervene to lock the thrust on that affected engine to idle. But even though this intervention happened very quickly, it would for a brief period of time generate a little bit more forward thrust on that engine, causing the required landing distance to actually increase with 55 meters relative to the old procedure. So back in the cockpit of Flight 3054, the captain knew about the new procedure, but he also knew the old procedure since it had been enforced during the majority of his A320 career. This meant that he also likely understood that if he used the new procedure, he would have to add 55 meters to the landing distance, something that he really didn't want to do. So it is very likely, even though we can never know for sure of course, that the captain now decided to use the old procedure instead to save those 55 meters. Now there are a few things that we need to keep in mind about this decision. One thing is that it has to be emphasized that in reality, they were never at any danger of actually overrunning the runway. In fact, with one reverser inoperative on a wet runway, the calculated landing distance was only 1,332 meters, which was well within the 1,935 meters available. So 55 meters doesn't seem like it would affect anything very much, but we also have to remember that the captain was very concerned about this landing. He would have known that if he overran runway 35 left by 55 meters, the aircraft would fall down an embankment and onto a busy street. So you can almost imagine him thinking, if that happened, I would have really regretted not saving those 55 meters. But on the other hand, we also know that this procedure was changed due to real accidents, not hypothetical ones, in which several people lost their lives. And when you take that into consideration, then suddenly using the old procedure doesn't really seem worth it. But unfortunately, it's very possible that the captain didn't know about those previous accidents, since TAM Airlines was not distributing information about accidents in other airlines to its A320 pilots during recurrent training. It's also worth noting that this kind of non-adherence to standard operating procedures was so common at TAM that the flight data recorder had recorded not less than 5 different techniques used by different crews for landing with this issue on previous flights, clearly showing issues with standardization. Now, having made this decision to use the old procedure of moving only one thrust lever into reverse, the prudent thing to do for the pilots would have been to brief the risks associated with it, or, well, the second most prudent thing to do after just using the correct procedure. But as I said, the captain probably didn't know the risks, and in any case, no discussion of this could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder at any point during the approach. Now, the captain did at one point remind the acting first officers that they were landing with only one thrust reverser, but he didn't further clarify exactly what that would mean in terms of actions for each pilot or what to look for. Now, if you combine this relative lack of situational awareness with the elevated stress that the pilots were likely experiencing, well, then you have a situation that is ripe for human error. At time 1854, TAM Airlines Flight 3054 passed the threshold of runway 35 left, fully configured and ready to land. With the flaps and landing gear fully extended, there would have been quite a lot of drag on the airplane, so the engines were producing a fair bit of power to maintain the proper approach speed, with an EPR sitting at 1.18. On the Airbus A320, when the outer thrust is engaged, which it basically is all the time, the thrust level position doesn't show the pilots what the engines are actually doing, like it does on the Boeing 737 that I fly. Instead, on the A320, the pilot selects a general thrust regime using thrust lever detents, and then the flight computers determines the exact amount of thrust required to achieve what the pilot wants the aircraft to do. So that means that when an A320 flight crew positions the thrust lever in a particular regime, like reverse, idle, cruise, climb or toga, that gives the outer throttle permissions to use any amount of thrust up to a programmed limit associated with that operating regime. And for this approach, the pilots had set both thrust levers to the climb detent in order to give the outer thrusts the authority it needed to maintain the approach speed with all of the flaps and gear fully extended. However, when the outer thrust is disconnected, well then the FADEC will start commanding a thrust output corresponding directly to the position of the thrust lever. Remember that. In the cockpit, the pilots now heard the standard radio altitude call-outs.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Followed by the main landing gear settling perfectly onto the runway within the touchdown zone and at a speed of 142 knots. And just before the aircraft touched down, an automated voice also called out
"Retard, retard,"
reminding the flight crew to reduce engine power back to idle. In response, the captain now grasped the thrust levers, likely very concentrated on the procedure that he was planning to use, since he knew that he couldn't afford to get this wrong. He therefore then moved the left thrust lever back to idle and then into reverse, causing the working left-hand reversers to immediately deploy. But unfortunately, by concentrating so much on moving only one thrust lever, he now inadvertently fell victim to the same mistake that had caused this procedure to be changed in the first place. He forgot to move the right-hand thrust lever back to idle and left it in the climb detent instead. The consequences of this error were immediate and severe. You see, on the Airbus A320, deployment of the ground spoilers is automatic, but can only occur when both thrust levers are positioned to idle or below. The ground spoilers are crucial for stopping the airplane, since they will spoil the lift from the wings, allowing the aircraft to settle down onto its landing gear and brakes. This is why the spoilers can only deploy when the thrust levers are in idle and the weight is on the wheel, since you really don't want them to deploy accidentally while in flight or during a takeoff or a go-around. But if the spoilers aren't deployed on landing, well, then the aircraft will continue to almost partially fly as it rolls down the runway. And since the weight of the airplane then isn't on the wheels, this greatly reduces the effectiveness of the wheel brakes, which are the primary means of stopping the aircraft. On the A320, it has been calculated that without the ground spoilers, braking effectiveness is reduced by up to 50%. But that's not all. Normally when landing, we also arm the outer brakes to almost immediately after touchdown apply wheel braking with a much quicker and smoother way than we normally would if we did it manually. But the outer brakes also won't work unless the ground spoilers are first activated. So this was very, very bad, but there was still more to come. You see, when the captain moved the left thrust lever into reverse, that caused the outer thrust to disconnect, which meant that the power output of the right engine now became derived directly from the position of the thrust lever, which, if you remember, was set in the climb detent. As a result of this, the right engine now stopped at 1.18 EPR, which was the same setting that it roughly had during the approach. But that extra thrust on the right side, coupled with the reverse thrust on the left, was now enough to start causing some real problems. Also, despite this obviously inappropriate thrust situation, the retard callouts in the cockpit still stopped as soon as the left thrust lever was positioned at idle, which, if you ask me, defeats the purpose of that warning almost entirely. As it turns out, this scenario had not been envisioned by the developers of this warning, until those previous accidents that I mentioned earlier revealed the flaw in its operating logic. Airbus then developed an update for the flight warning computer that would have triggered both a master caution alarm and an ECAM warning message if a thrust lever was positioned above idle during landing. But unfortunately, this update was never made mandatory, and as a result, TAM Airlines had tragically neglected to install it. So instead of a clear warning, the pilots now received a sudden barrage of other subtle indications that something was very, very wrong, but nothing directly pointing to the culprit. After touchdown, the acting first officer soon recognized that the spoilers had not deployed, but instead of calling this out immediately, he instead waited and called out the positive operation of the number 1 thrust reverser instead, then followed by a mechanic sounding spoilers nada, meaning no spoilers. This did not highlight the high importance of the missing spoilers, but even if it had, there weren't any memory items for no spoilers for the captain to action. As this was happening, the captain had obviously realized that the plane wasn't decelerating normally, but he initially likely thought that this was due to the expected aquaplaning on the runway. This meant that for the first agonizing 6 seconds, no real manual braking was applied. After that, he started applying first asymmetric braking and full right rudder to try and control the direction of the aircraft, which was now starting to swerve more and more over to the left. He then applied max manual braking, but it didn't help much. Without the spoilers, the wings were still generating lift, so the tires just skimmed across the runway surface, and as soon as he applied the brakes, the wheels would have locked up due to the insufficient friction, which in turn would have caused the anti-skid system to relieve braking pressure until the skid stopped. So as a result, even max manual braking would have seemed to have almost no effect. Within just a few seconds, this situation likely caused a sense of mounting dread and panic in the cockpit as the plane rapidly chewed through the available landing distance, veering more and more towards the left due to the asymmetric thrust. It was later determined that if the pilots had recognized the incorrect thrust level position within the 7 seconds after the first officer's no spoiler call out, well, then the aircraft would have been able to stop on the runway. Now, when you are speeding down the runway, 7 seconds actually seems like an eternity, so why didn't the pilots figure out what was happening? Well, we will never know this for sure, but there are several possibilities. One factor is that it was dark in the cockpit and the thrust levels on the Airbus are kind of small and hard to see. But more important, in my opinion, is the fact that on the Airbus, the thrust levels are often both out of sight and out of mind. Since they aren't constantly moving in response to the outer thrust commands, looking at the thrust levels usually isn't a useful way to determine how much thrust is actually being produced. This could have made the thrust levels a less obvious thing to look at when the pilots realized that the plane wasn't slowing down. It's also worth noting that the captain would have been very focused on applying as much brake force as possible, because that's an instinctive human panic reaction in such a situation, as well as trying to get the directional control back. Now, this would have greatly reduced his ability to troubleshoot, so it would have fallen to the acting first officer to try and find out what the problem was. But he only had 220 hours on the Airbus and had been rushed through his training, so his odds of putting these quite technical puzzles together in time would have been pretty low. All of this meant that Flight 3054 was now traveling down the runway at well over 100 knots, whilst also drifting more and more over to the left. The captain did everything he could to try and counteract this drift using rudder and brakes, but rudder authority decreases as the speed goes down, so the asymmetric thrust soon completely overcame his ability to control the aircraft. The airplane soon crossed over the runway edge lights and onto the grass as the pilots tried desperately to get it to stop, but it was now far too late. Traveling at the speed of 96 knots, the aircraft now first crossed over the taxiway and then careened off the left side of the runway end zone, becoming briefly airborne for a few seconds as it flew over the 16-meter high embankment. It then just barely cleared the major boulevard below before it finally crashed directly into a fuel station and a building housing the offices of the TAM Airlines Express Cargo Service. The airplane was completely destroyed on impact, and the wreckage was consumed by an enormous fuel fire, taking the lives of all 187 passengers and crew on board. The fire burned for well over 24 hours, and in the process it also took the lives of a further 12 people inside of the building that was hit. This was, and still is, the worst air disaster in the history of South America. The final report found that there was not one single cause to this disaster. The immediate reason was that the captain had forgotten to move the right thrust lever from climb back to idle, which prevented the braking systems from working, making it impossible to stop on the runway. But even though that was the direct cause, it wasn't really why this crash had happened. This error was deemed to have been made possible by a combination of stress and poor organization. The captain was facing intense stress due to numerous factors, including the dangerous airport, the wet weather, the high landing weight, the inoperative reverser, the accident on the previous day, the industry climate, the management culture, and the unusual crew composition. And all of this stress greatly increased the likelihood of a mistake happening. The risks associated with this kind of stress can be greatly reduced by just talking about it amongst the crew, but we don't know whether that actually happened here, and we never will. At the same time, the pilots were essentially on their own, without the kind of support systems that we would expect at all levels in this industry. In the end, Brazil's Accident Investigation Agency issued no less than 82 separate recommendations after this accident. One of the most important ones was that ANAC needed to find a way to add runway and safety areas at Congonhas, even if that meant shortening the runway down. It just wasn't acceptable to have a situation where almost any runway overrun was potentially fatal at the busiest airport in Brazil. Now, ANAC was slow to react to this, but changes did eventually take place. And in 2022, runway 35 left and 17 right was fitted with something known as Enhanced Materials Arrestor Systems, or EMAS, at both ends. This system consists of a bed of crushable material that collapses under the aircraft's landing gear, generating friction that brings a speeding airplane down to a stop within a very short distance. The installation of EMAS has greatly increased not only the available safety margins, but also the pilot's peace of mind when landing at cramped airports like Congonhas or even Chicago Midway. And this is especially important in a time when the number of runway excursions is actually going up, even as most other types of safety incidents are becoming less common. This Airbus A330 is on final approach, but something is seriously wrong.
Too low.
In the cockpits, the pilots are fighting for their lives to try and slow the careening aircraft down, and what has caused this situation is stranger than you would ever believe. Stay tuned. Accidents happen for a variety of reasons, but in almost every case the root cause can be traced back to something very benign. Maybe a small mistake that someone makes, sometimes weeks or even months before the accident. That initial mistake is then always followed by several others, allowing established safety barriers to be crossed in what we now know as Dr. Reason's Swiss cheese model. This is why, to be able to fully understand any accident or incident, we have to go back to the very first thing that put the ball in motion. In this story, that means going back to 2001, to the planning of an extension to the apron on Juanda, Surabaya Airport in Indonesia. The original plan was for 10 aircraft stands, which are basically parking spaces for aircraft, to be built next to the existing stands on the airport. But to start with, only stands 5 to 10 had actually been completed. The remaining 4 stands were to be constructed at a later stage, so that last bit of land next to the apron was left unpaved until a need to expand would eventually arise. Meanwhile, stand 5 to 10 were fitted with what's known as fuel hydrants, basically a grid of underground fuel pipes leading up to each stand. This system enables the aircraft fuelers to just hook up a pump car to the hydrant and then start pumping fuel directly from a centralized tank, instead of having to haul the fuel around in huge fuel trucks. This is very common in larger airports, especially at stands where larger, long-haul aircraft are to be refueled, since they generally need enormous amounts of fuel. Now, the pump trucks, which are used to complete refueling, fill several important functions. Obviously, they provide the pressure needed to suck the fuel from the hydrant and then push it into the aircraft, but they also incorporate a couple of fuel filters, which acts as the last barrier to fuel contamination before the fuel enters into the aircraft tanks. The fuel is pumped through these filters, and the pressure differential between the intake of the filter and the output must be closely monitored, since any increase in that differential pressure might indicate some type of fuel contamination from the system. So, what type of fuel contaminations can exist then? Well, there is obviously a large variety, but the most common one is water, which can enter into the system in various different ways. Either as free water from condensation inside the tanks or an outside source, or as water solved in the fuel itself, which can break out as free water when the temperature of the fuel changes. If there is water contamination, this can then lead to further microbiological contamination in the fuel, like fungi or algae, kind of like the inside of a dirty swimming pool. On top of that, there can of course also be other forms of dirt, pieces of rust from piping and other small contaminants, so these filters are super important. But how will a filter be able to catch water, you might ask? Well, that's a great question, and it will introduce you to one of the big villains in this episode, called super absorbent polymers, or SAP for short. Part of the filters inside of the pump trucks has a layer filled with these little polymers, and their job is to attract any water content in the fuel and then absorb it. When that happens, the SAP powder turns into a type of gel, and it effectively stops the fuel from continuing to run through the filter, increasing the differential pressure a lot and therefore giving a clear indication that the fuel is contaminated. This, by the way, is the same type of polymers that you can find in some variants of diapers. Anyway, about a month before the accident flight, Cathay Flight 780 was scheduled to depart, the work to complete those remaining 4 stands had finally started. The weather was miserable during the period, with rain almost every day, and before the concrete could be laid on the new apron, the piping for the new fuel hydrants needed to be completed. This included some quite elaborate welding work, and great care was taken when placing the new tubes out and then connecting them to the already existing piping for nearby stands 5 to 10. Now, the Surabaya airport is situated quite close to the sea, and the closest regulating pool, constructed to control the water levels around the airport, was only 300 meters away from the work site, and it was mainly containing seawater. As the work continued in the pouring rain, pools of salt water therefore started to build up inside of the work area. All of the stands with hydrants connected to the work area had of course been turned off and sealed as the work was going on, and before they and the new hydrants could be reconnected, the fuel company, Pertamina, who was in charge of all of the fueling on the airport, had to flush the whole system clean using fuel. After that flushing was then completed, the Indonesian Civil Aviation Authorities, DGCA, had to come in and inspect and finally approve the installation before it was allowed to be used again. Now, the flushing of the system was eventually done on the 9th of April to the best of Pertamina's ability, but without any real guidance for how to do it and how much fuel they had to use. After the flushing, the Pertamina crew who had been conducting the work assumed that since the circuit from stand 1 to 10 had now been opened and flushed, it could safely be used again, even though the final inspection had not been completed. And it looks like at some point during the construction and piping work, some salt water must have entered into the system, and it had not been properly flushed out before the hydrants were connected again. This brings us to the 12th of April 2010, which was the day before the accident flight. On this day, another aircraft from Cathay Pacific was operating out of Surabaya and had uplifted fuel from the hydrant at stand number 6. After departure and during the cruise phase towards their destination, the pilots of this flight noticed some fluctuations on their engine parameters, specifically on engine number 1, but they didn't receive any associated warnings and the engine seemed to be continuing to work well. They continued to their destination and reported these fluctuations to the maintenance engineers, and the engineers had a look at it and they decided to change the fuel metering unit, which is the unit that effectively controls the fuel input into the engine. After the FMU was replaced, the engine worked fine, so no further tests were conducted and no one connected this issue with the fuel uplift in Surabaya airport. The following day, on the 13th of April, a crew consisting of 2 pilots and 11 cabin crew were scheduled to operate Cathay Pacific Flight 780 from Surabaya to Hong Kong. They had arrived from Hong Kong the previous night on the same aircraft and had now enjoyed a nice night stop before they were supposed to return back to their base again. The homebound flight was scheduled at 8:20 local time, so the crew arrived to the airport and started a pre-flight briefing about an hour before that at 7:20. The captain of the flight was reasonably young, only 35 years old, but had already amassed over 7,700 hours of total time, and 2,600 of those had been flown on the aircraft they were now going to operate, the Airbus A330. He was joined by a 37-year-old first officer who was also reasonably experienced with just over 4,000 hours of total time and 1,171 of those flown on the 330. He had only been working for 3 years for Cathay at that time, and before that he had flown 11 years in the Royal Australian Air Force. The two pilots started their pre-flight briefing by checking through the logbook, which they were already quite familiar with since they had operated the same aircraft on the day before. The aircraft was a 12-year-old Airbus A330-342 with two giant Trent 700 turbofan engines fitted to it. It had no technical faults recorded in the logbook and had worked perfectly on the previous day, so they were quite confident with it. They then proceeded to check the weather and NOTAMs for the 6-hour-long flight they had ahead of them, and everything looked reasonably well, with only a few thunderstorms around the route and possibly a bit of crosswind in Hong Kong later on, but everything was well within their comfort zone. They decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for the flight, and then the captain walked over to the cabin crew and proceeded to brief them about the flight. The cabin crew, they were also really experienced. They were led by an in-flight service manager who was supported by 1 senior purser, 3 junior pursers and 6 junior cabin crew. Since there was nothing special expected during the flight, the briefing was concluded relatively quickly, and they then proceeded out to the aircraft, which was now being made ready for refueling at stand number 8. The pilots had decided to uplift 24,400 kilos for a total departure fuel of 33,400. And when the captain started his walk around, he saw that the fueler was doing a fuel quality check, so he walked over to have a look at it for himself. A fuel quality check is made by taking a fuel sample downstream of the pump car's fuel filter and then visually verify that it's clear and doesn't contain any visible contaminants or free water. The fuel sample that was taken looked great, so the captain happily continued his walk around as the fueler started uplifting the fuel. But just a few minutes into the fueling, the fueler noticed that the fuel hose seemed to be vibrating more than normal. He knew about the recent reconnection of the underground fuel system, so he assumed that there might be air bubbles in there causing the vibration, just like in your kitchen faucet when the water has been turned off for a while. He stopped the fueling for a few seconds and then resumed, which momentarily solved the vibrations, but he had to do so several times before all of the fuel was uplifted. Also, strangely, when he later checked the diff pressure around the fuel filter, he noticed that it had risen a bit. Now, he noted that down in the pump truck's logbook and thought maybe it's time to change the fuel filter soon, and then he continued his duties. Now, what had actually happened here was that the remaining salt water which had been left inside of the piping had now gone into the filter, where the SAP particles had caught it just as they were designed to do. But what was not designed was the fact that this was salt water, not normal water, and the salt particles attached to the SAP particles, causing the filter to not block up completely as it was designed. Instead, the filter had continued to let fuel pass through, but the pressure inside had caused the filter to deform and for the fuel to start backflowing through the filter and bypass it through the hose and then into the aircraft. That was likely the cause for those vibrations that the fueler had felt during the fueling. Now, this wasn't great, but it still wasn't supposed to be a huge deal. Aircraft engines are certified to be able to run with quite significant amounts of fuel contamination, so one broken filter should normally not have been such a big problem. But what no one knew was that the now broken filter had started to produce a completely new type of contaminants, which no one had calculated with, and this was the SAP particles themselves. The fuel filters inside of the aircraft engines are graded to be able to catch all particles down to a size of around 40 micrometers and to catch around 90% of all particles between 10 and 40. But that meant that inside of the fuel that was now being uplifted was a contaminant that was to a large part smaller than even the engine filters were able to remove. This will end up having some severe consequences. As the captain was still outside during his walk around, the cabin crew welcomed the 309 passengers on board and guided them to their seats. The first officer was preparing the cockpit, and when the captain came back, he started briefing him about the expected departure route, and then they completed the before start checklist. The gate agent came in with a fuel receipt, and the whole operation was flowing really smoothly. So smoothly, in fact, that they were fully ready for departure 10 minutes ahead of schedule. So at time 8:11, they received their pushback and startup clearance and started moving away from their stand. The weather for departure was super nice, with only some scattered clouds around, very light winds and a temperature of 28 degrees centigrade. Perfect weather for flying. The aircraft taxied out to the holding position for runway 28 whilst the pilots completed the last pre-flight checks. And at time 8:24, the Airbus started accelerating down the runway for takeoff. The takeoff and initial climb out was completely uneventful, with the first officer hand-flying the aircraft to just over 1100 feet and then engaging the autopilot. At this point, everything looked like it was going to be a nice routine flight back to Hong Kong. But deep within the Airbus's fuel system, the sap spheres were now sloshing around in the tanks, getting closer and closer to the pumps who were sucking fuel into the engines. The fuel system of the Airbus A330 comprises of several inner and outer wing tanks, and then a separate fuel tank in the horizontal stabilizer. In the wing tanks, collector cells are situated near the wing roots, and from there the two main pumps sucks fuel in and delivers it to the engines. There's also a standby pump outside of the collector cell if it should be needed. After the fuel has been sucked from those tanks, it is then pumped via a heat exchanger used to cool the engine oil, and then via the engine low pressure filter to the high pressure pump, which creates enough pressure to run the subsequent fuel metering units, or FMU. The FMU then provides the correct amount of fuel to the engine burners. Now, obviously there are about 1 million more separate components to the system, but that should give you a general idea of how it looks. Each engine is controlled by a separate Electronic Engine Control Unit, or EEC, which is basically a small computer that senses thrust lever and auto thrust input and then translates that into commands for the FMU, depending on things like outside conditions, engine performance and many more things. Inside the FMU there are several mechanical valves that are designed to keep the fuel pressure constant and to act immediately and with great precision to the EEC demands. Now, I know we're getting quite far into system designs now, but all of these things are important to fully understand what's about to happen. Before I stop talking technical stuff, there's only one more system I want to mention, and that is a system inside the engine known as the engine airflow control. You see, when air moves through a jet engine's core, it will flow past first the low, then intermediate and finally high pressure compressors before entering into the burn chambers. This flow normally works perfectly at higher rotation speeds, but when the engine is forced to suddenly change speed or run at lower RPMs, there can be sudden changes in the pressure, which can cause what's known as engine surges or stalls, if it's not properly controlled. Engine surges are basically compressor blades stalling, causing air to flow the wrong way inside of the engine, and that's not great since it can cause damage to the engine and severely affect its performance. Now, to make sure that that doesn't happen, several variable stator vanes and bleed valves have been built into the engine compressor stages to make sure that the pressure can be accurately controlled. Since I mentioned before that these pressure changes are directly caused by changes in engine speed, these valves and vanes are actuated with the help of something known as fuel hydraulic, which is basically fuel pressure from the high pressure fuel pump. And that means that this system is directly connected to the function of the fuel system. As the aircraft was now climbing out on its way up towards the northeast, the pilots started noticing some quite abnormal engine pressure ratio fluctuations on engine number 2. It fluctuated around 0.015 EPR, and when they looked at engine number 1, it was also fluctuating, but not as much. This was a bit strange, but there were no warnings associated with it, and the engines were running fine, so the pilots just discussed it and decided to continue the flight, and to tell the engineers about it when they arrived to their destination. But about 33 minutes into the flight, just after they had leveled off at their cruise altitude of 39,000 feet, a warning suddenly appeared on the ECAM, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. The warning stated Engine 2 control system fault, and with the sub-information Engine 2 slow response. But it didn't have any checklist action items for the pilots to do, it was just for their information. The captain immediately got into contact with Cathay Maintenance Control via satellite phone in order to get some help interpreting and possibly troubleshooting the issue. The engineer who took the call asked the pilots to check how the engine responded to thrust lever movements. And when the pilots tried to do that, they could see that the engine did respond, but that the EPR was still fluctuating a bit around the target. The engineer and captain then continued to look through their manuals to see what could possibly be causing this without finding anything specific. They also discussed the possibility of changing the engine control from EPR to N1 instead, but decided against it since the engine control seemed to be working fine, it was just fluctuating a bit. The engineers in the control center were able to monitor the engine parameters remotely via data link, and from what they could see, the engines were performing well. So they advised the crew to continue to monitor the situation and call again if something else would come up. Based on the information they had at that point, the pilots just discussed the information but agreed that they were happy to continue the flight. Of course, what they didn't know was that the sap spheres inside of their fuel had now started to concentrate inside of the wing collector tanks, and more of them were being sucked into the engine fuel system. Once they were in there, they seeped through the engine filters and started depositing themselves around linkages and valves within the fuel metering units and other crucial parts of the system. So what the pilots were seeing on their engine instruments was actually the result of those valves having a harder and harder time to move because of the contamination. Now, this didn't really manifest itself as a huge problem as long as the engine speed was held more or less constant and there was very minimal movement of those valves needed, but that would of course not last for very long. 1 hour and 15 minutes after the first warning, the pilots were asked to descend from flight level 390 to 380 as they entered into the Malaysian Kota Kinabalu airspace. And as soon as the aircraft leveled off at the new level, the Engine 2 control system fault ECAM warning reappeared. This time it was accompanied by both the information "Avoid rapid thrust changes" and Engine 2 slow response. The pilots acknowledged the info, but again there was no real items for them to complete. They tried to switch on and off the engine anti-ice to see if that would have any effect on the EPR fluctuations, but nothing really happened. The engine still was working fine and responding to thrust level demands. Now, again, there were no information in the manuals about what the underlying conditions for these warnings actually were. But we know that the "Avoid rapid thrust changes" warning indicates a problem with the engine airflow control. Remember, that's the part of the system with the variable inlet guide vanes and bleed valves. And the other warning had to do with the fuel metering unit. So here we can already see how the sap spheres had started to affect more and more components inside of the number 2 engine fuel system. And of course, what's inside engine number 2 would eventually also reach engine number 1. The captain now called up the maintenance control again with quite a bit more concern this time and asked them if they could see what they were seeing and if it was really safe to continue the flight. This time there was another engineer who took the call, who had been briefed by the situation by one of his colleagues. He looked at the data again and confirmed that from their standpoint there was nothing alarming going on. They had checked and there had been no maintenance action taking place overnight, which could explain a sudden misbehaving engine, and the other parameters looked similar to the first time that they had called up. The engineer then had a look at the number 1 engine and considered that that one was working well without any real issues. Yeah, there were some minor EPR fluctuations on that side as well, but he thought that that might be due to the engine trying to compensate for the fluctuations on the opposite side. This, by the way, whilst being a plausible theory, is not really how these engines actually work. They work by trying to keep the aircraft's speed as close as possible to the required speed, but not by compensating the exact thrust output. But he also said that the message "Avoid rapid thrust changes" was related to the variable guide vane system, and that the crew should move the thrust levels carefully to try to avoid any exceedances. If an exceedance would happen anyway, they should just follow the procedures in their manuals, and in any case, the FMU was going to be replaced when they reached Hong Kong to sort this issue out. This explanation sounded good to the pilots, who now felt more happy again to continue the flight. Now, before anyone starts to have any opinions regarding their decision making here, remember that these 2 pilots had no idea about all of the other things that I've already told you regarding the fuel contamination. And the Airbus warning system had not been programmed to connect the dots with this either. In the pilot's eyes, they had had some minor fluctuations on mainly one engine, which had caused 2 different warnings, which didn't have any action items connected to them, and all of this was being monitored by their maintenance control remotely, and they had deemed it safe. Now, I would have likely taken exactly the same decision as these 2 pilots did if I was in their shoes, and that's also what the final report ultimately said. The flight continued without any further issues, and about 1 hour and a half later, at time 12:55 Hong Kong time, the aircraft entered into the Hong Kong FIR and started coming into range for the arrival 80s. The captain copied the ATIS via their ACAR system, and it indicated that runway 07 left was in use with the wind coming from 160 degrees at 9 knots, but it was varying between 100 and 160 degrees, meaning that it could be both tail and headwind for the landing. The visibility was more than 10 kilometers, with few clouds at 600 feet and scattered clouds at 1800 feet, temperature 29 degrees, dew point 24, and a QNH pressure setting of 1013 hectopascals. But there was also a SPECI report added to the ATIS, advising of significant wind shear forecasted for both runways due to the varying winds. Now, except for the wind shear warning, this was quite good weather, and the first officer started preparing for an ILS approach into runway 07 left. He planned for a flaps full landing, and after having checked the landing performance, the pilots both agreed to use the low autobrake setting, as the runway was very nice and long. After the briefing, they were handed over to Hong Kong radar, who cleared them to follow the Subno 2 Alpha standard arrival route just as they had briefed. And before they started the descent, the captain made a normal PA to the passengers. They were then cleared to initially descend to flight level 230, and this is where things really started to get interesting. At time 13:19, as they were descending, the pilots heard a light popping sound, followed by a smell in the cockpit of ozone and something burning. This was then almost immediately followed by an ECAM warning saying engine number 1 control system fault and engine 2 stall. This was not good news. The captain started actioning the ECAM actions associated with the engine stall, which included reducing the thrust back to idle on engine number 2. This effectively meant that they now only had engine number 1 available to them, which was now starting to show the exact same ECAM warnings that engine number 2 had previously shown. This was including engine number 1 slow response and avoid rapid thrust changes. The SAP spheres had now also reached the inner part of that engine. The captain moved the number 1 thrust lever forward into the max continuous thrust detent in accordance with the single engine procedures, but the engine responded only by increasing the thrust up to about 57% N1 before dropping back again to 37%, which was close to idle. The pilots now knew that they were dealing with something far more serious than they had previously thought. The captain pushed the transmit button on his radio and called, "Hong Kong Cathay 780, pan 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 pan. We're operating engine 2 on idle thrust but otherwise normal procedures. We would like to request an elevated response level." A PAN call is an urgency call, which means that an aircraft is dealing with something unusual and might require priority, but that there is no immediate risk to the lives of the people on board or the safety of the aircraft. The air traffic controller acknowledged the PAN call and decided to notify the airport's fire and rescue services to make them ready in a state known as local standby. This would have them deployed and ready if something would happen after landing. Since the pilots realized that they were now going to effectively have to fly the approach on only one engine, the procedure stipulated that the captain should fly the approach. So the captain rebriefed the approach according to the single engine profile, meaning flaps 3 instead of flaps full, and made sure that everything else was correctly programmed into the flight management computer. He then asked air traffic control if they could get priority, which was immediately approved, and then they were cleared towards a waypoint called Limes, which forms part of the transition into the ILS for runway 07 left. They started turning towards that waypoint, but before he took over controls, the captain also contacted the in-flight service manager and explained the situation to her. He asked her to please start preparing the cabin for landing and to have a look out on the right-hand side engine to see if she could see something unusual and report back if she did. The service manager read this back and then hung up the handset, and as she was started to walk down back through the aircraft, the captain made a PA to the cabin crew to start preparing for landing. So far, this was handled in an excellent manner by the whole crew, with all parties involved, informed and participating. It was really nice to see. The aircraft was now given continuous descent clearances, and with the captain now in control, things were about to take a further turn for the worse. At time 13:30, when they were about 45 miles away from the runway, the aircraft needed to momentarily level off at 8,000 feet. This meant that the captain had to add thrust on engine number 1, but when he did so, the ECAM message engine 1 stall appeared, and that meant that their only remaining engine was now starting to have some real problems. The pilots completed the ECAM actions, which included reducing the thrust to idle on that engine as well, meaning that now both engines were in idle. And when the captain tried the engines by disconnecting the outer throttle and moving one of the thrust levers forward slowly, one at a time, there was no response from either of them. Instead, the ECAM message engine 1 stall just came back again. This was really bad. The aircraft was at 8,000 feet with a speed of around 295 knots at this point, with 45 nautical miles to go. A general rule is that an aircraft will glide about 3 times its height in nautical miles, plus maybe 1 mile per 10 knots above its stall speed. So that would mean 8 times 3, 24, plus maybe another 12 if they were lucky. That's around 36 miles, which was clearly not enough. With that in mind, the crew now elected to make a mayday call, notifying air traffic control that they were experiencing a double engine stall situation. They were immediately cleared to descend to 3,000 feet, but could not yet start to turn visually for the airport as they were still inside clouds at this point. Knowing that the flight directors were giving him instructions based on the assumption that both engines were still working, the captain now asked for the flight directors to be turned off, and he also disconnected the autopilot and started flying the aircraft completely manually. Now, the reasoning behind taking away the automatics at this point will be left up to the captain to explain, but sometimes when you're dealing with an aircraft that is not behaving as it should, flying it manually might give a better overall technical situation awareness and a better feel for the aircraft. In any case, the first thing he did after disconnecting was to pitch up slightly and start climbing, which had the double effect of gaining him some altitude, which is glide distance, and reducing the speed back towards the green dot speed, which is the best speed for single engine operation, in this case around 202 knots. Both of these factors would help the aircraft reach as far as possible if they couldn't get at least one of the engines back working for them. Whilst the captain was doing this, the first officer started the auxiliary power unit, the APU, and he switched both engine start selectors to ignite. This would provide continuous starter ignition inside the engines to counteract any potential flameout. The aircraft now finally broke through the clouds, meaning that the pilots could actually see the airport. The captain tried to slowly move the thrust levers up from the idle position one at a time again, but initially there was still no response from any of them. But after a few tries, engine number 1 finally responded and started increasing to an N1 around 74%, with the thrust levers in the climb detent. This was of course a little bit less than it should be giving with the thrust lever in that position, but it was more than enough to keep the aircraft flying and even accelerating a bit. Engine number 2 never responded and remained at an N1 of 17%, which is less than idle, meaning that it had essentially failed. At time 13:36, the first officer gave the cabin crew seats for landing over the PA, and a few seconds later he also added cabin crew to stations, which meant that the cabin crew should now start getting ready for a possible evacuation after landing. The cabin crew immediately reacted and called up the cockpit and advised them that they were now fully ready for landing. The captain was now visually maneuvering towards the runway, and the tower advised him that he was cleared for a visual approach and that he could choose between runway 07 left or right, whichever he preferred. As this was going on, there were several more ECAM messages displayed, which kept displaying over the next few minutes, none of them relevant to the engine problems that they were facing, so they were quickly disregarded. Instead, the first officer asked the captain if he should try to action the QRH action items for an all-engine flameout fuel remaining on engine number 2 to see if that could maybe get it back up running. The captain agreed to try, so the first officer deployed the ram air turbine, the RAT, he selected the APU bleed air switch to on and cycled the number 2 master switch to off and then on again, but to no avail, the engine remained below idle. Now, using that checklist did not form part of any stipulated procedure for this particular situation that they found themselves in, but it certainly made sense and could have, if the fault was of a different nature, solved the problem. This type of thinking outside of the box actions are all hallmarks of great technical knowledge and airmanship under a very stressful condition. After that, the captain now wanted to start preparing the aircraft for landing, so at time 13:42 he asked for flaps config 1 to be selected. The aircraft was at this point at 5,600 feet with a speed of 219 knots, about 9 miles away from the airport. That's pretty high, but very understandable given that the captain knew that he could lose the remaining engine at any point and he wanted to have the option to continue to glide in. But he now wanted to start decelerating, so he moved the number 1 thrust lever back to idle detent, but here came the next problem. The engine did not respond. Instead, it continued to deliver around 74% of thrust, meaning that from the altitude that the aircraft now was, and with that kind of thrust, they were way too high and had way too much energy to complete the stabilized approach. But the captain knew that he had no choice. There was no telling how long he would have that remaining engine working, so he just had to get this aircraft down.
He decided to continue flying through the extended scent line to give himself some more track miles and then re-establish on the final from the north instead. At the same time, the captain also took up the PA mic and made a short PA to the passengers, telling them that they were experiencing some problems with their engines, which was causing the vibrations that they could all feel, and he also told them to remain seated and listen carefully to the commands of the cabin crew. Now, he could have let the first officer make this PA, but the truth is that during actual emergencies, it's important for both the passengers and the crew to hear the captain's voice and for him to reaffirm the authority of the cabin crew. Again, a really stellar performance. As the aircraft re-established itself on the center line, it was still at 5,200 feet, 8 nautical miles away from touchdown, and now with a speed of 234 knots, which was just way too high. The captain extended the speed brakes and the landing gear to try and increase the drag as he pitched the nose down towards the runway, and this helped a little bit, but not enough to keep the speed below the maximum speed for flaps 1, which was 240 knots. This caused an overspeed warning to start sounding in the cockpit, and this happened at the same time as the pilots were going through the landing checklist. Hong Kong Tower now cleared the aircraft to land runway 07 left and gave them the surface wind of 150 degrees at 13 knots, meaning a moderate crosswind from the right. Engine number 1 was still producing around 70% of thrust, making the deceleration impossible for the crew as they continued to blast down towards the runway with a speed around 100 knots faster than they should normally have. The captain stowed the speed brake and armed it for landing instead, so that they would get the help of the automatic ground spoilers after touchdown. As the aircraft passed 732 feet, the speed was still 227 knots, which flaps 1 selected, and this high speed caused a much higher than normal vertical speed, which in turn now triggered the ground proximity warning system.
Too low, terrain. Pull up.
Could now be heard together with a second overspeed warning. The cockpit environment was now super stressful, but it didn't seem to affect the two pilots too much. They were still calmly discussing different options they had, like if they should try to extend flaps 2 or not. The captain said that the flaps would likely not come out due to the high speed, but the first officer suggested that they should at least try it anyway. Flaps 2 was selected, and almost immediately they received a flashing F relief warning, indicating that the flaps was not extending to the full flaps 2 position, but instead to an intermediate position to protect the flap mechanism from the high aerodynamic loads at that speed. Anyway, there was not much more that the pilots could do at this point. They just had to get this aircraft down, so the captain just continued pressing on. The GPWS kept blaring "too low terrain" and "pull up" as the runway kept getting closer and closer at an alarming speed. At time 13:43, the Airbus A330 touched down on runway 07 left about 680 meters in on the runway with a speed of 231 knots, almost double the normal touchdown speed. The right main wheel touched down first, but because of the speed it had and the right crosswind, it immediately bounced up again, causing a slight bank to the left. Now, the captain knew that there was no room for any bouncing at this speed, so he pushed the nose forward and the aircraft touched down a second time, but due to the high bank and the now downward momentum, the left engine cowling now slammed into the runway, causing sparks to fly behind them. At this point, the ground spoilers finally extended, killing all of the lift from the wings and bringing the full weight of the aircraft down onto the wheels and onto the brakes. The first officer initially called "no spoilers, no reverser green light, no diesel," and that caused the captain to disconnect the auto brake, which was set to low by the way, and apply max manual braking. The reversers were also selected, but only the now damaged engine number 1 reverser actually deployed. The aircraft kept barreling down the runway, transferring an enormous amount of kinetic energy onto its brakes, but eventually it started to slow down, and it finally came to a full stop about 300 meters before the runway end. Immediately after the aircraft had touched down, the fire trucks had entered the runway behind them and started chasing the aircraft down the runway. Now, as the aircraft had come to a complete stop, they approached carefully from each side to try and assess the status of the aircraft and its brakes. Inside of the cockpit, the pilots gave out a short sigh of relief, but they knew that this wasn't over yet. Maybe there was a fire outside on the brakes and the wheels, and there would be a need of an evacuation. The captain made an immediate PA to the passengers, saying that they were evaluating the situation and asking them to please remain seated. The flight crew then proceeded with shutting down the engines and running through the remaining ECAM checklist, which they still had on their screens. The captain now mentioned to the first officer that he was initially keen to go with the safe option of keeping the passengers on board and then disembark them normally. Now, that might come as a surprise to you, but it's actually true. An evacuation is a maneuver which is almost always going to cause passenger injuries, and it's supposed to only be used in case of a directly life-threatening situation. The tower directed the captain to get into contact with the fire leader on frequency 121.9, and whilst he did so, both pilots watched how the brake temperature indicator kept rising towards 1000 degrees centigrade. As a precaution, when they saw this, they now started doing the evacuation checklist down to the actual evacuation command, just to have everything prepared in case it would be needed. And it soon would be. The fire leader informed the pilots that he could see smoke and fire coming off the brakes and that they were now spraying water on them to try to cool them down. The captain asked him to confirm that he could actually see fire, and when the fire chief did so, the captain elected to initiate the evacuation, which I completely understand, because it's really hard to foresee how any type of fire might develop. So without any more precise information than that, if you hear fire and smoke, you evacuate. When the captain called the evacuate command, the cabin crew were all prepared and reacted immediately by opening all 8 emergency exits. All slides were deployed except for one in one of the aft doors where the slide had been disarmed after landing by mistake. That door was then closed, rearmed and opened again, which solved the issue. The whole evacuation took 2 minutes and 15 seconds to complete, which is a bit longer than the calculated 90 seconds it should take, and that was most likely due to the fact that several passengers, against the direct instruction of the crew, elected to take their hand luggage with them. The 2 pilots and the in-flight service manager evacuated the aircraft last, after first having walked through the entire aircraft and verified that everyone had exited safely. Out of the 322 passengers and crew on board, 259 evacuated without any issues. 62 received minor injuries like scrapes and bruises, and 1 passenger damaged her ankle so bad that she later had to have surgery. But all in all, this was a fantastic outcome given what had actually happened. After the engines were then examined by the investigators, the SAP particles were quickly found, and the whole fuel system on the associated stands at Juanda Airport were shut down, cleaned and then rechecked before they could be used again. ICAO was asked to create better guidance for the testing of these systems, and the Indonesian authorities were also criticized for their lack in oversight. New fuel filters for the pump trucks were designed to make sure that this type of contamination could never happen again, and Airbus updated their warning systems to associate these type of warnings with possible fuel contamination and then give pilots the suitable guidance they would need. Finally, both pilots were given the Polaris Award for airmanship in 2014 for their outstanding handling of this emergency. Now, if you found this interesting, then you will love these videos as well. Consider supporting the job that I'm doing by joining my Patreon crew, buying some merch, or even send a super thanks. It's all hugely appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.